Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of the Risk 4.0 video blog series. In this particular episode, we aim to discuss why standardized risk methods cannot control complex wicked risk. And the reason that I've chosen this particular topic is because I am fortunate enough to have just submitted my PhD thesis for final review. Now, for anybody who's ever done a PhD or an advanced thesis of some sort, you'll know that there are two components to it. The first is you have to demonstrate a known industry problem, and the second is that you have to demonstrate a potential for solution. So the fundamental argument made by my particular research thesis is that standard risk methods are impaired within environments of advanced complexity, and thus new risk management thinking and methods are required. So in order to truly articulate the industry problem at hand, I've tried for the purposes of visualization and discussion just to represent it in a very simple 2x2 matrix. So have a look on the left-hand side, the y-axis if you will. Imagine we could delineate risks between what I call inherent or emergent risk. Inherent risk are those risks that a typical industry or organization expects to incur. They're either known, they're obvious, or they're uniform. For example, in banking, fraud would be an inherent risk. Mining, safety, retail, theft. These are good examples of inherent risk. We expect them to happen. Emergent risks are those risks that are a little bit more vague, indefinite, obscured, or possibly dynamic. They're always shifting. And because of that, it's never truly clear whether they're going to occur or not. So on the one hand, you have risks that are inherent. On the other hand, you have risks that are emergent. Equally, if we look down at the x-axis, imagine we could delineate risks between discrete risks and what I would call systemic risks. So your discrete risks are those single, isolated, independent, or localized events. Equally, systemic risks would be those risks that are highly connected and are dependent on numerous contributing factors. So let's start by considering those risks that may exist in the bottom left-hand quadrant, where risks are both inherent and discrete. Now, these risks could probably be better described as your simple order type of risk. They are driven by cause and effect. This plus that leads to that. They're very easy to understand. Hazards are a really good example. If we don't put grips and rails on stairs, it will lead to trips and falls. So hazards are a very good example of a simple order type risk. In the top left-hand quadrant, where risks are both emergent and discrete, we might have risks that we could call connected. They are connected by a series of events. Although it's a specific type of risk, a number of causal factors lead to an inevitable outcome. Probably a good example of these are those airline disaster shows that you see on the Discovery Channel, Countdown to Disaster, Seconds to Disaster, that kind of thing. They normally demonstrate an auditable trail of specific connected events influenced by external factors led to the particular disaster occurring. So now if we move down to the bottom right-hand side, where risks are both inherent and systemic, then what we've got are risks that we might call complicated. That means there are multiple factors connected to each other and everything's shifting and everything's codependent. The idea being that when one component shifts, everything else adjusts accordingly. A good example of the risks that would exist in this quadrant are probably economic risks. All the economic markets around the world are adjusted for each other. They're all connected. They're all codependent. All the buyers, the sellers, the prices, the commodities, they're all connected in a systemic ecosystem of sort. When one adjusts or one changes, everything else adjusts and changes accordingly. In the top right-hand corner, this is probably the one that is the most interesting and the one that we're going to spend the most amount of time talking about today. This is where risks are both systemic and emergent, and they can range from both complex to chaotic. And when we get to this level, we're talking about multiple factors influencing everything else. Everything's changing, everything's highly energized. There are multiple contributions. The scales of the contributions change, the nature of the relationships change. And if you haven't got it already, what I'm starting to describe is what is known in the risk management profession as a wicked problem or a wicked risk. Now, the concept of a wicked problem was first developed, I believe, in 1973 by Rattel and Weber. And basically what they were describing was a highly energized problem which has a fundamental resistance to resolution, primarily due to continually shifting circumstances. And a really good example of the type of risk that would live in there is something like the Palestinian problem. On a good day, it's complex. On a bad day, it's chaotic. But it's never less than that. Every time they try to propose a solution, everything changes and shifts accordingly. And it's constantly going backwards and forwards between chaos and complexity. It doesn't matter what we put in there, what solutions we put in there, it doesn't seem to be resolved. It just shifts and changes to a new state. And this is the reality of many of our modern risks right now. It's not just the Palestinian problem, it's most of our macro threats are sitting in this top right hand quadrant. And the fundamental problem with wicked risks is that they cannot be solved by standardized risk management thinking. And this is a big lesson learned for industry. When we get to that level, when we get to the level where risks are either complex or chaotic and they're continually shifting and the relationships are continually moving, now what we have to start doing is start thinking about complex systems. We have to actually start looking at resilience theory, complexity management, systems thinking, or systems theory at least. So we're playing at a very different level when we get to that top right hand corner. The bottom left, that is very much the domain of the standardized risk management, and maybe even in the other two quadrants where the risks are connected or complicated, we could get away with some standardized risk thinking. But by the time we get to the top right quadrant, we're moving into a whole new league of risk. And this is something that industry seems to be slow to learn. We still appear intent on putting standardized risk thinking to complex, wicked problems. This is square peg, round hole scenario, and we need to move beyond this. And I'm going to give you an example of where this has become problematic. Consider the COVID pandemic. It's been 2 years in the making, and we're in a very different situation now to where we were perhaps in March 2020. But let's just have a look at how we first approached it. When COVID first came along, for whatever reason, we put it into that bottom left-hand corner. No doubt in my mind. We saw it as a simple ordered problem. Therefore, we could put some causal factors to it. We could put some linear cause and effect type thinking. And what we came up with was that lockdowns and vaccines will equal a resolution. And for the longest time over the last 2 years, that has been the mandated control strategy worldwide. Mass lockdowns, vaccinate everybody. That will equate to a resolution. All right. Now, it's been a very emotive and divisive topic, so I'm not going to get into the efficacy of that particular strategy. I'm just pointing out that we had a very cause and effect driven control strategy for COVID at the beginning of 2020. The problem with that appeared to then unfold over the next 2 years. And it came in the form of 2 years of evolving COVID variants. All right. We had five major variants: Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and more recently Omicron. And that just excludes all the minor variants that came and went that didn't materialize into anything. And that could include Epsilon, Zeta, Eta, Theta, Iota, Kappa, Lambda, Mu, and the list can go on. There's even a new variant coming along called Deltacron. And the problem with those variants is that what we soon learned is that lockdowns and vaccines alone weren't working as we believed that they were. They weren't as efficient or as effective as we first believed. And the reason being was because COVID was never a simple state risk. What COVID actually was a wicked risk. It lived in the top right hand corner. We just failed to recognize it as such. We tried to implement standardized risk thinking, standardized risk solutions to something that was essentially a complex to chaotic problem. This is known as classic linear reductionism. It's when we reduce a complex problem to basic cause and effect. It's also in some circles referred to as simplicity bias. That's whereby we purposely oversimplify a complex problem in order to justify assigning the least amount of effort or resources to addressing the problem. The challenge that we now have is that in the year 2022, we now find ourselves in a situation that for all the harsh lockdowns that we endured, we still have not eradicated the coronavirus. But what we have done is created numerous other societal and systemic vulnerabilities, which we now have to deal with in parallel to the virus. More concerning, however, we now find ourselves in a situation whereby less than 35% of our 7.5 billion population are believed to be effectually vaccinated right now. And the reason for that is because the speed of emerging COVID variants is outpacing the speed at which vaccinations can either be applied or they stay relevant. In short, as soon as we vaccinate people, that becomes redundant because a new variant comes along. So we now find ourselves in a situation that after 2 years of lockdowns and vaccines, we're actually no closer to a resolution. And that is kind of a little bit scary. But that is unfortunately the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, it's not just COVID. There are numerous other macro threats out there which are equating to wicked problems, and we're trying to apply standardized risk thinking to it, and it's becoming problematic. If you have read this year's global risk report for 2022, the key message there was that for the past 2 years we have stalled our working world, and in this time our global society has not grown more resilient. It's actually grown more vulnerable. And if you look at the top 10 threats facing the world right now, which will materialize, are expected to materialize over the next decade, you'll see that there are a couple of there that are brand new. Predominantly the socially driven ones, the livelihood crisis, social cohesion erosion, a lack of faith of the establishment. There's a lot to unpack in that, but the bottom line is that we have actually created significant vulnerabilities in the last year because we have tried to apply standardized risk thinking to a complex, wicked problem. So if we take all those risks and we that are actually in the latest global risk report, and we try and map them out on my little simple 2 by 2 quadrant, what we'll notice is that there's a couple of clusters. So this is my particular point of view. You may not share it, but I'm just going to talk through it anyway. All those green risks, which are essentially the environmental factors, I put them kind of in the complicated zone, trending towards complex and chaotic. And the reason I say that is because they're all connected, and we also understand the root causes of them. We understand what is causing those problems. For whatever reason, we're just simply failing to respond or to change. And as a result, these risks are getting bigger. So I see them more as complicated as anything else, but they do have the tendency to trend towards chaotic. The red ones, which are our new societal issues, living in crisis, social erosion, more diseases. These are new vulnerabilities that have been created by the last 2 years of lockdowns and COVID vaccine mandates. This now is creating social erosion. And the reason I put them in the complex to chaotic is because I don't think this is going to be resolved very, very quickly. I think there's too much diversity in this. And anytime that you get humans involved in risk, it's complex straight away. So I've put them in the complex to chaotic zone. And then the last new risk, the debt crisis, I put that more towards the standardized side, purely because debt can become a simple risk. It can have cause and effect applications, but it could equally trend up towards complex. So I put that more in the simple ordered zone, but you're equally valid to have your own opinion on that. I think the key message here, regardless of whether you agree with where I've placed these or not, I think the key message that we're starting to learn is that there's a gap. Standardized risk methods are better suited for the bottom left hand of the quadrant, not the top right hand of the quadrant. And this is the industry problem that we now have to face. We are experiencing more and more risks that are sitting in that top right hand side. That means more and more risk professionals are going to have to start learning up, skilling up in the complex systems thinking genres, complexity management, systems theory, resilience theory. These are all things that we as risk professionals are going to have to get better at, because the risks that we are facing now are more complex, more wicked, and more disruptive ever before, and standard risk methods don't suit them. So if I had to reduce the industry problem that I'm arguing to just a simple one pager, it would look something like this. Many of our existing conventional risk methods still view material risk as behaving with a very linear cause and effect type manner. The reality, however, is that most of our modern macro risks are more likely to be trending towards being complex, wicked, or chaotic. And this creates a very real problem for the practicing risk management profession. You cannot solve complex, wicked problems with standardized risk thinking or standardized risk methods. And we need to actually start accepting that. Now, if you can come to that realization, it opens up all sorts of interesting opportunities for furthering your thinking on this topic. Resilience theory, systems thinking, complexity management. There's a wealth of information in those disciplines that could be used in the risk management profession. And we risk management professionals need to actually start leveraging that information. And this is what I hope to talk about in some of the future sessions. So this particular one looked at a known industry problem that people are researching, not just myself. But in future sessions, I want to start talking about some of the potential solutions and how that can be represented in forms such as disruption, resilience management, complex systems thinking, and the like. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to the next one, which I'll probably post in a couple of weeks' time, so look out for this. If you like this one, you can look up some of the previous sessions, which are available on all the usual platforms. And until next time, keep safe. Thank you.